Every evening, as she sat by the fireplace in her cozy armchair, she would remember that one person she had dreamed of while standing on the edge of the cliff by the sea. Back then, gazing into the distance, she seemed to be trying to see him in the fading rays of the sunset, the one who would understand her, who would be the only one. And it all came true. She met him, not as in dreams, without any magic or grand gestures. It happened simply, almost casually, at the airport when she arrived in Vienna. The wheel of her suitcase had broken, and dragging it was pure torment. Then came a voice from behind. "May I help you?" She turned around. Before her stood a man who smiled, easily, naturally, a smile that seemed made for his face. He was dressed simply, jeans, a plaid shirt, and elegant brown shoes. Without waiting for her answer, he took the suitcase and walked beside her. To the exit, to the taxi stand. Everything seemed ordinary, yet there was something special about him. Perhaps the light in his eyes, or maybe that smile that made her want to smile back. She left for the hotel, where silence and travel weariness were already waiting. Everything felt as usual, until she turned in the lobby and saw a familiar figure. He stood at the reception desk, talking to the clerk, and, as if sensing her gaze, turned around. "You're staying here too?" she asked, slightly surprised. "It seems fate decided not to let you go just yet," he replied with that same kind smile. They talked. He invited her for a cup of coffee at a small cafe across the street, the air filled with the scent of cinnamon and fresh pastries. Outside, the autumn city moved quietly. The conversation flowed easily, as if they had known each other for years. He told her he was an architect, that he loved old houses, because they breathed with time, that he listened to jazz in the evenings and often came there just to sit and think. She listened, and his voice seemed to warm the air around her. When the cups were empty, he said, "Let me show you the city tomorrow. Not the one from the guidebooks, but the real one, with quiet courtyards and ancient stairways." She agreed, almost without hesitation. The next morning, he met her at the entrance, under a light drizzle, with an umbrella and his unshakable smile. They walked through narrow streets where the cobblestones glistened with morning mist and the air smelled of chestnuts. He spoke of Vienna, not as a guide would, but as a man in love with every stone, every window of an old house. She listened and felt as though a window had opened in her life, letting in light and air. They stopped before an old building with a high arched doorway. "There's a place here I go when I need to remember why it all matters, the rush, the work, the cities. Come, I'll show you." It was a small gallery. Inside, dim light, the scent of old wood and quiet. On the walls, paintings filled with color, silence, and light. And then, one painting that held her gaze, the sea stretching into the distance, and a woman standing on a cliff, staring at the horizon. He stepped closer and said softly, "This one's my favorite. Everyone sees something different in it." She didn't speak. Because that sea, that sky, that look, they were hers. Her dream, her longing. And suddenly she knew, it was him. Not in words, not in gestures, but somewhere deep inside, like recognition, like coming home. She stood there, gazing at the painting, and felt that same feeling come alive again, the one she had dreamed of by the sea. It was there. It was him. He noticed her thoughtful silence and asked, "Do you like it?" "Very much," she whispered. "Everything here feels as if I've been here before." He looked at her closely, almost seriously, and said, "Perhaps it's simply time you came back."
She sat on the edge of the cliff, as if she herself were part of that silent stone. Moonlight touched her shoulders, silvered the strands of her hair, and dissolved them in the glow of the night. The sea roared below, lulling her heart, and at the same time disturbing it, as though it knew her secret. She was married, yet her soul lived apart from that bond. At home, familiar conversations, daily cares, weariness. But here, by the sea, her true life awakened, the life of her dreams. She imagined him, the one, the only, who would be able to look into her eyes and understand without words. A man who would not pass by her silence, who would not push away her longing, but embrace it as his own. She did not know what his voice would sound like, but she already felt it would be dear to her. Each time she came here, she believed the sea was carrying her thoughts to him, that somewhere beyond the horizon he too was gazing at the stars, thinking of a woman he had not yet met, but who already lived in his heart. She smiled to herself, for now it was only a dream, but dreams are life as well, and sometimes they become reality.
She could hardly believe it had truly happened. It all unfolded so quietly, as if the sea itself had brought him to her shore. No grand gestures, no coincidences, just one day flowing into another until, suddenly, he was there. At first, a glance. Then, a word. And soon, a warmth beside her that needed no explanation. He didn't promise her the stars or speak in loud declarations, yet every touch was a confession, every silence an understanding. He simply was, and that was enough to make her world feel whole again. For the first time, she felt that beside him she didn't have to pretend, she could be quiet, gentle, and still be seen. Now, as she sat by the window watching raindrops slowly slide down the glass, she smiled at the memory. Everything that once seemed like a distant dream had become her reality. Love hadn't come as a storm, it arrived like a soft, warm rain. At first, you don't even notice it, and then you realize, everything around you has already been soaked in its quiet tenderness. She had dreamed, and the dream had answered. Now she knew, miracles aren't always loud. Sometimes they come when you simply sit by the window, listen to the silence, and let the rain speak for you. They stepped out of the gallery under a soft drizzle. The air was clear, as if the city had just been washed free of haste and dust. Vienna sounded different, in the rhythmic patter of rain on cobblestones, in the distant chime of a tram, in the breath of an old city where every window held a story. He walked beside her, slightly ahead, shielding her umbrella from the wind. She looked at his profile, calm, assured, a little thoughtful, and felt that same quiet warmth spreading inside her, the one she had once dreamed of while watching sunsets by the sea. They stopped by a small cafe on the corner, its windows fogged, soft light glowing from within. "Shall we go in?" he asked. She nodded. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fresh pastry. Outside, rain. Inside, warmth and music. A saxophone played softly, as if only for them. They sat by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass. "You know," he said after a pause, "sometimes I think we don't really meet new people. We just recognize those we've carried within us all along." She looked up. "Perhaps," she answered softly. "It just takes courage to admit that it's real." He smiled, and in that smile was something of the painting itself, the sea, the light, the endless tenderness. The rain kept falling. Time seemed to stop. She listened to him talk about his childhood, about the old house on the edge of town where he first learned that walls could hold warmth like memory. He listened to her, not interrupting, simply being there. And at some point, she realized she was no longer waiting. No longer dreaming, no longer imagining, just living the moment that had already come true. He was talking about his travels, about funny encounters, about how sometimes the smallest things can change an entire day. She listened, smiled, nodded, yet more and more she found herself no longer hearing the words. Her attention wasn't on his stories, but on his voice, that calm tone, that warmth wrapping around her from within. The candles flickered, reflections dancing across their glasses, and time itself seemed to thicken, like honey. She looked at him and thought, this is it, the feeling she had feared and waited for. Not a spark, not a storm, but a quiet, nearly invisible recognition. As if her heart had simply found its home. Outside, the rain grew softer, the city seemed to listen with them. She turned her eyes away, hiding the tremor of emotion, and looked out the window, at the reflections of lights on the wet streets. And suddenly, in the glass, she saw them both, he and she, side by side, as if it had always been that way. Warmth filled her chest, and deep within, peace. A peace she hadn't felt in years. She realized she didn't want this evening to end. That ahead of them lay something more than a meeting. Something she had dreamed of while standing by the sea. Something that now sat across from her, smiling through the soft light of the candles. The morning was soft, like the touch of silk. She stepped out of the bathroom wrapped in his shirt, a little too big, carrying the scent of coffee and that subtle fragrance that belonged only to him. The fabric brushed gently against her skin, and the scent awakened memories of the night before, a night without unnecessary words, only glances, breathing, and that infinite feeling as if the world had stopped. She walked to the window. Outside, rain was falling. The city was still half asleep, lost in shades of gray and gold. He was already sitting at the table, holding a cup in his hands. 2 roses stood on the windowsill, croissants beside them, and everything seemed so ordinary, yet within that ordinariness was something new, as if life itself had lowered its voice, afraid to disturb the moment. He looked up and smiled. "Good morning," he said softly. She nodded, sitting down across from him. The silence was warm, like an old blanket. Their eyes spoke more than words ever could. There was tenderness, a quiet wonder, and that very feeling she had once dreamed of while standing on the cliff by the sea. She brought the cup to her lips, inhaled the aroma of coffee, and suddenly realized. Her life had changed. Not because of grand events or accidents, but because of one simple thing: he was there. And deep within, something serene began to take shape, a stillness, a harmony the soul had longed for. They sat in silence, looking at each other, speaking wordlessly, the kind of silent conversation that exists only between those whose hearts already beat in the same rhythm. No words were needed anymore. Each glance was a confession, each breath a promise. They both knew, today they would have to part. She would fly back to her world, and he to his. 2 lines that had once crossed would now drift apart again. She understood it would be a trial. Because now, when she had finally found what she had longed for all her life, she would have to let it go. How strange, to live so many years searching without knowing whom you seek, and only now, looking at him, to understand, it's him. The one the sea once whispered about, the one her soul had always reached for. He looked at her, calm, a little sad. His mind was full of thoughts, yet he said nothing. He was afraid to disturb the fragile balance in which they now existed. He, too, knew that this day was a boundary. That tomorrow would bring back ordinary life, work, meetings, people. But all of it would already be different. Because somewhere in the world, she existed. And he thought, why does the real always come when we've stopped expecting it? Why do the meetings that change everything happen when it already feels too late? He looked into her eyes. There was everything. Warmth, tenderness, farewell, and something else, a quiet promise. That no matter where they were, their souls would still remain close. They drove to the airport together. Silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because words no longer had meaning between them. The car glided softly along the wet road, the city fading into the gray morning beyond the windows. And each of them knew, in just a few hours, they would both be gone. Together, yet on different flights. And not only different flights, but different countries, different lives. They sat side by side, their eyes meeting now and then in the reflection of the glass. And that was enough. Their silence wasn't emptiness. It was presence, quiet and complete. As if their souls were speaking softly beneath the surface of the world. When they entered the departure hall, time seemed to thicken, slow and heavy. like the rain against the windows. She knew he would be leaving first. He stood beside her, calm on the outside. But there was something fragile in the way he breathed. As though each moment might be the last. "It's time," she said quietly. He nodded, and in that small gesture was everything. Understanding, gratitude, and what needed no words at all. A brief embrace. Her hand in his, just for a heartbeat. And then he turned away. Not looking back. Because he knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to leave. She remained where she was. Walking slowly toward the tall glass wall. That opened onto a world of rain and lights. Beyond the glass, the plane was taxiing toward the runway. Its wings glimmering under the gray sky. Raindrops streaked the window, blurring its shape until it seemed to melt into the clouds. She watched it move. Watched it pause. Then lift. A single line of light rising into the distance. And only then did she allow herself to breathe. Not with sorrow, but with a quiet calm. Because she knew. This wasn't an ending. It was the silence between two meetings. The pause between two breaths of one soul. And somewhere up there, in another sky, he sat by the airplane window, looking down at the faint shimmer of city lights, thinking of her, the woman who stood by the glass, carrying the same quiet light in her heart. It felt as though his presence lingered nearby, in the air, in the faint scent of his shirt, in the warmth that still lived in her hands. She remembered standing by the glass, watching his plane disappear into the gray sky. Now she was flying herself, toward her own thoughts, into that strange emptiness that follows something real. She wasn't afraid of distance, nor of silence, but of time. Of the quiet way it can erase what feels eternal. What if the scent of his shirt fades? If his smile dissolves into memory? If his voice, now echoing in her heart, becomes too faint to hear? She closed her eyes and whispered, so softly it felt like a secret, "You're still with me." And for a moment, she felt lighter. Because she knew. A bond born not from habit or promise, but from the sudden recognition of two souls, doesn't disappear. It simply grows quiet. Like music within you. Heard not by the ears, but by the heart. She spent the entire flight thinking about him. Every thought was filled with the realization that her life had changed, completely, irreversibly. She couldn't think of anything else. Meanwhile, the plane had already landed. And it was time to leave. To step back into her old life. Into the same routine and familiar cares that awaited her at home. She made her way alone. Her husband, as usual, didn't come to meet her. That no longer surprised her. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she suddenly felt that she hadn't come home. She was merely a guest here. Everything around seemed strangely foreign. Dim, almost colorless. The comfort of the house, the familiar things. None of it touched her anymore. A wave of emptiness and loneliness swept over her. Her thoughts, and perhaps her very self, remained somewhere far away. Wandering the same streets. Sitting in that quiet cafe, where she could still hear his gentle voice in her mind. Evening was falling. And with it, everything around began to change. She couldn't start anything. Inside her, that same quiet music still played. The one born from their final glance before takeoff. She knew that life would go on. But now it carried a different depth. Each moment had become more transparent. As if the world itself had learned to breathe softer. And yet, deep in her heart, a quiet hope lived. Not expectation, not a dream. But a simple knowing. They would meet again. It didn't matter where. In Vienna, by the sea, or in some distant airport. Where suitcases roll across the tiles. And someone once again might say, "May I help you?" He came home late. The city greeted him with cold air and the shimmer of streetlights. Reflected in the wet pavement like 1,000 unspoken questions. He walked slowly, without hurry. And in every window, every reflection, he thought he saw her. Not her face, but her presence. The apartment was quiet. He turned on the light, took off his jacket. Poured himself a glass of wine. And even that simple act felt strange. As if his life had shifted key. He sat by the window, staring into the night. And caught himself waiting. As though the phone might ring. Or a message might appear. Short, simple, like a breath between words. He wasn't used to feelings like this. Years had passed, cities, faces, encounters. All dissolving, leaving no trace. But now, everything felt different. He remembered her that morning. Her eyes, her silence. The way she looked at him, as if memorizing every second. And he realized, he had been doing the same. Trying to hold on to everything. The scent of coffee, the sound of her steps. Even the soft light falling across her hair. He didn't know what to call what had happened between them. It wasn't desire, and it wasn't a promise. It was recognition. As if two souls, tired of searching, had finally found each other for a brief, precious moment. He lifted his gaze to the sky. To where her plane had once vanished among the clouds. And for the first time in a long while, he wanted to believe. Night covered 2 cities. 2 countries, 2 lives. And yet, within that silence, something still connected them. She lay in the dark, not turning on the light. Listening to the rain outside her window. He stood by his own. Watching the wind bend the trees in his city. They both thought of each other. At the same moment, without knowing. As if someone had quietly tied their breaths together. With a thin, invisible thread. She whispered his name, not aloud. But deep inside, where dreams are born. And in that same second, he lifted his head. As though he had heard her whisper. Across the distance, across time itself. He closed his eyes and pictured her. In that same morning dress. Hair slightly tousled. With that same gaze. That carried everything. Tenderness, farewell, and a promise unspoken. She knew she couldn't simply forget. The feeling wasn't fleeting. It had entered her like the breath of the sea. Remaining in that quiet place. Where the heart remembers longer than the mind. And that night. 2 souls breathed in the same rhythm. In different beds, under different skies. But to the same melody. The one they both called soul harmony. Night calls. She couldn't fall asleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the quiet rhythm of the rain outside her window. The house was silent, almost too silent. She turned from side to side, as if trying to find a place where her thoughts could finally rest. And then, a sudden, gentle sound broke the stillness. Her phone rang. She froze. His name glowed softly on the screen. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. But the phone rang again, and her heart answered before she could. "You're not asleep," his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "No," she smiled, unable to hide it. "And you?" "Neither. Maybe because, you're still somewhere close." Silence followed, but not the kind that separates. It was warm, living, like the breath before dawn. They didn't ask how the other was. Didn't try to fill the space with words. They just listened. To her breathing, to his pauses. And in those pauses lived everything they didn't dare to say. He told her about the rain in his city. The same rain that now tapped gently against her window. They laughed at the thought that maybe it was the same rain. Falling from the same sky. Just on different sides of it. Time slipped quietly away. They spoke not of the future, not of the past. But of that fragile moment that held them together. And when the call finally ended, she sat there, phone still warm in her hand. As if his touch had never left. He called again. Already knowing she wasn't asleep. It was past midnight, that hour when the city exhales, and everything around becomes more honest. "Aren't you tired of talking to me?" he asked, smiling, though she couldn't see it. "No. With you. I don't get tired." He fell silent, listening to her breathing. Those pauses between words felt sacred. As if they held more meaning than all the sentences he had ever spoken. "You know," she whispered, "everything feels different now. I came home, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. I think I live where we are, when we talk." He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe home isn't a place," he said at last. "Maybe it's a person. You've become that for me." And those words stayed suspended between them. Like a fragile fire, warm, but delicate. She told him about her fears. About how often she felt like she was walking through life on tiptoe. Trying not to disturb the fragile peace everyone calls happiness. He listened without interrupting. Sometimes he only said, "I understand." And she believed, he truly did. They talked until dawn. And as the light began to creep into the sky, she suddenly felt that the world had become just a little easier to breathe in. Between the lines. The nights had become their time. When the world fell asleep, they seemed to awaken, living within those few fragile hours between dreams and dawn. Her phone would light up with his name, and her heart, as if remembering the rhythm of these moments, would begin to beat differently. "Are you awake?" "Yes, and you?" "Me too. I just wanted to hear you." Then silence. But within that silence lived more than 1,000 words could ever say. Sometimes he would write simply, "I miss you." Sometimes, just a single dot. And she knew, inside, that that was everything he couldn't put into words. She told him about her day, small things, faces, glances, passing thoughts, and would suddenly realize she wasn't talking about her day at all, but about him. He listened. And when she fell silent, he would say softly, "You know, it feels like we're not just talking, we're living inside these words." And so the nights passed. Each dawn brought a quiet ache. For when the light returned, their connection seemed to dissolve into the brightening sky. But they both knew, evening would come again. And with it, their world of whispers and words. Where feelings needed no explanations. and everything that truly mattered lived between the lines. With each passing evening, their conversations grew longer. Yet the words became fewer. Now they often sat in silence, simply listening to each other's breathing. And within that silence lived everything: tenderness, longing, understanding, closeness. She began to notice strange things. Sometimes, sitting by the window, she suddenly felt as if he were near. The faint scent of coffee, a trace of warmth on her shoulder. And a whisper so quiet, it seemed the wind itself was speaking her name. And he, thousands of miles away, would wake in the middle of the night for no reason. Staring into the darkness and smiling. Feeling the same presence, her breath somewhere close. He didn't understand how it was possible. But he knew, she could feel him too. They no longer needed words. Every message, every call, was only proof that they existed for each other. They lived in different countries, in different worlds, but within one shared universe, where between two hearts, distance no longer existed. Weeks passed. They still spoke through the nights. Laughter, silence, breath, short phrases. And yet something had begun to change. The world around them had grown too small. As if the very distance that once connected them had now become a quiet ache. For the first time, she dared to say, "I can't just hear you anymore. I need to see you." He was silent for a long moment, then softly replied, "I know. Me too." After that, no more words were needed. No date, no place had yet been chosen. But they both knew, the meeting was inevitable. It would not simply be the meeting of two people, but of two souls that had been walking toward each other. Long before this life began, she found herself tracing the map again, marking cities, roads, airports, and suddenly realized that everything once impossible was now only a matter of time. And he, waking in the middle of the night, opened one of her old letters and felt his heart respond. Everything had already been decided. All that was left was to wait for the morning, when two planes would cross the sky, flying toward each other. The airport was bathed in soft morning light. People hurried by, voices echoed, suitcases rolled across the polished floor. But to her, it was all just background noise. She stood by the exit, holding a cup of coffee, trying to steady her trembling hands. Yet her heart kept racing too fast. Every minute of waiting felt like an eternity. Her eyes kept searching the crowd, hoping to catch that familiar silhouette, the one that lived in her memory, in her dreams, in every thought since they last said goodbye. And then he appeared. He simply walked, calm, steady, and smiled as if he had always known she would be there, waiting. She froze. The air grew heavier. The world around them stopped. No footsteps, no voices. Only him. He came closer, Words were unnecessary. He just reached out and took her hand. And she didn't pull away. It happened so naturally. As if they were simply continuing what had once been paused. And in that moment, all waiting turned into breath. All distance into a single touch. And silence, into the harmony of two souls. The city greeted them with the gentle glow of streetlights. Wet pavement shimmered, each step echoing softly in the night. They walked side by side, not touching. Yet something unseen flowed between them. An invisible thread, trembling in every glance. He spoke about small things. Random encounters, flights, moments between places. And she listened, smiling as if it was déjà vu. As if she had heard these words before. In another life. In another time. They stopped by an old bridge. A thin mist drifted above the river. And the reflections of the lights mingled with their silhouettes. He looked at her. The way someone looks when they've been searching. And finally found. She met his gaze. And that moment became a silent confession. The wind brushed past their shoulders. And the city seemed to breathe with them. There was no rush. No need for words. Everything had already been said. In their silence. In their steps. In the way two souls finally moved in harmony. The city greeted them with the gentle glow of streetlights. Wet pavement shimmered, each step echoing softly in the night. They walked side by side, not touching. Yet something unseen flowed between them. An invisible thread, trembling in every glance. He spoke about small things. Random encounters, flights, moments between places. And she listened, smiling as if it was déjà vu. As if she had heard these words before. In another life. In another time. They stopped by an old bridge. A thin mist drifted above the river. And the reflections of the lights mingled with their silhouettes. He looked at her. The way someone looks when they've been searching. And finally found. She met his gaze. And that moment became a silent confession. The wind brushed past their shoulders. And the city seemed to breathe with them. There was no rush. No need for words. Everything had already been said. In their silence. In their steps. In the way two souls finally moved in harmony. Morning came quietly. As if afraid to disturb the fragile stillness. Where the echoes of the night still lingered. Outside, the city was slowly awakening. Cafes opening their doors. The first footsteps on the pavement. And sunlight slipping through sheer curtains. Resting softly on her shoulder. She woke first. He was still asleep. And she simply watched him. Allowing herself to memorize everything. His breathing. His hands. The soft curve of his lips. That still carried the warmth of her kiss. She rose quietly. Wrapped herself in his shirt. And walked to the window. The world was the same. Yet everything within her had changed. There was no loneliness anymore. Only that strange, tender calm. As if, after a long journey, she had finally come home. He opened his eyes. And their gazes met. No words, no questions. Just a quiet smile. That held everything. Understanding, warmth, and the silent promise. That neither time nor distance could ever take this away. Time turned into an enemy again. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly. Each minute bringing them closer. to the moment they'd have to say goodbye. He stood by the window, watching the rain trace slow lines down the glass. She packed her things quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile stillness where their morning tenderness still lingered. Neither of them knew what the right words should be. Maybe there were none. How can you put into words what lives deeper than breath, where feelings exist in silence? He came closer, took her hand, and said softly, "I'll find you, wherever you are." She looked up, and in her eyes was everything: pain, gratitude, and a promise. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. Their eyes said all that was left unsaid. When the door closed behind her, the silence became almost tangible. He stood still, feeling that a part of him left with her. And yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a journey. They would now walk together, even if on opposite sides of the world. She was born into a wealthy family, where everything around her was carefully arranged and precisely measured. Her father, a man of power, a high-ranking official, was disciplined, demanding, and distant. Her mother, refined and graceful, devoted herself entirely to raising their only daughter. Their home was filled with light, piano melodies, and the delicate scent of roses freshly placed in crystal vases. Her childhood seemed perfect: private tutors, language lessons, piano practice, and etiquette classes. She learned French, German, and a touch of Italian. She carried herself with quiet confidence, always composed, always graceful. But behind that calm, elegant facade lived a girl who secretly dreamed of something real, of emotions untamed and genuine, not rehearsed or proper. Until the age of 17, she had never known what it meant to love. Her life moved between home, studies, and carefully chosen friends. Only when she entered university, in another city, where her father rented her an apartment, did she finally taste freedom. She was beautiful. Not the kind of beauty that tries, but one that simply is. There was something serene and magnetic about her, like the stillness of a morning lake. Men noticed. She saw the way their eyes lingered, how they fell silent when she passed. It gave her a strange sense of power, but also confusion, as if beauty itself was a burden she didn't know how to carry. Her first love was a classmate, gentle, awkward, sincere. Their love was innocent, almost childlike, long walks through quiet streets, late talks about dreams and books, soft touches, rare kisses. She often wondered if this was love or simply the longing to be understood. Later, she met the man who would become her husband. He was older, confident, and elegant, the kind of man who knew how to impress. He courted her with flowers, dinners, and the promise of a beautiful life. She believed she had found safety and affection. At first, it seemed true. They traveled the world together, Paris, Rome, Vienna, Prague. Lavish hotels, city lights reflected in wine glasses, laughter echoing on foreign terraces. But with time, the light began to fade. He became distant, his gaze colder, his interest waning. She noticed how rarely he looked at her, how mechanical his words had become. And one evening, sitting across from him at dinner, she realized, here was a man who knew everything about her, and nothing of her. Years passed. Their marriage, once filled with laughter, travels, and soft promises, slowly turned into a routine. At first, she didn't notice how the ease between them faded, how silence settled between conversations, and how warmth left his eyes. But week by week, month by month, that silence grew heavier, until it became the air they breathed. He was often away on business, coming home late, tired, and distant. She tried to talk to him, to explain what she felt, what she missed. But every time, he would respond calmly, almost mechanically. You're imagining things. Everything is fine. And that, everything is fine, felt like a verdict. Gradually, she began to retreat into herself. Books, music, evening walks, the things that once filled her heart with joy now merely helped her survive another day. She realized she spoke to herself more often than to her husband. The deepest wound, however, was his refusal to have children. She dreamed of laughter in the house, of small hands clinging to hers, of a life filled with meaning. But every time she tried to speak about it, he would cut her off. Why do you need that? We already have everything. Everything, for him. But not for her. She felt the growing distance between them, a quiet abyss that swallowed her hopes, her faith, her love. He never raised his voice, never insulted her. Yet there was something cold in him, something possessive and distant. His jealousy was not loud, but constant, a shadow always nearby. He was jealous of glances, of voices, of air itself. He didn't want her to work. You don't need to. I can provide for us, he'd say. At first, she agreed out of love. Then out of fatigue. And finally, out of indifference. The house remained beautiful, their life looked perfect from the outside. But inside, everything was quietly falling apart. One morning, as she opened her eyes, she realized, she lived beside a man, but her soul no longer lived with him. Once, she was afraid of loneliness. It seemed cold to her, like a winter morning without sun. But with time, she learned to live with it, as with a silent companion that never leaves. At first, it was painful. The house, filled with silence, felt too big. Every sound echoed, even the ticking of the clock reminded her of how slowly time was passing. She began to seek solace in the things that made her feel alive. Books became her closest friends. She reread Remarque, Maupassant, Paulo Coelho. Music returned to her life, the old piano, once covered in dust, came back to life under her hands. Those melodies became her confession, her quiet dialogue with her own soul. Sometimes she would sit by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, and think, somewhere out there, someone must be feeling the same. The same emptiness, the same longing for something real. She started to travel alone. Paris, Prague, Florence, cities she once visited with her husband now looked different. Without his shadow beside her, they came alive again. In each place, she rediscovered herself, the woman she had lost long ago. On riversides, among street musicians, in old cafes smelling of bread and memories, she learned to listen to herself again. And for the first time in years, she felt alive. She didn't know that these quiet journeys, those silent evenings by the sea, sitting on the edge of the cliff and staring into the distance, would become the prelude to a meeting, the one that would change everything. The morning was gray, humid, and almost faceless. She was returning home from a short trip, a little tired, but calm. Her suitcase rolled along the polished airport floor until one of its wheels jammed. She bent down to fix it, and then heard a quiet, confident voice behind her. "May I help you?" She turned. A man stood there, and something in his eyes felt strangely familiar, as if she had seen them once, in a dream, or another life. He smiled, and that smile seemed to warm the air between them. Simple plaid shirt, jeans, brown shoes, nothing extraordinary. Yet there was something about him, something unspoken, a calm certainty, a quiet strength, a warmth that drew her in. He didn't wait for her reply, he simply took the suitcase and walked beside her. They reached the taxi area, exchanged a few words, casual, but with that hidden pulse that makes speech unnecessary. Then he raised his hand, a brief farewell, and disappeared into the crowd. She stood there, watching him go, and in that moment she felt it. Nothing that had happened in her life, the years of silence, waiting, loneliness, was in vain. All of it had led her here, to this moment, to this meeting. Now let's tell the story of our hero. He was one of those people who never hurried to talk about themselves, yet every movement, every glance carried a quiet strength and a kind of weariness gathered over the years. He wasn't the kind of man to whom life came easily, quite the opposite. Life had made him go through much before it taught him to truly appreciate silence. He was born into an ordinary family, no wealth, no special privileges. His father, a military man, lived by strict rules and expressed love through discipline. His mother was gentle but strong, the one who softened the hard edges in a house where order and precision ruled. From childhood, he was used to independence, waking up early, helping around the house, studying well, not out of passion, but out of duty. When the time came to choose a profession, he didn't know what he wanted. He entered an engineering faculty, on his father's advice, not from personal desire. His studies came easily, but never brought him joy. He was more drawn to people, to their actions, their hidden motives, but he kept it inside, believing such reflections were not for men. After graduation, he worked in different cities, climbed the career ladder, changed positions, but inside he always felt a quiet emptiness, as if he were walking someone else's road. He knew how to be reliable, responsible, how to make an impression, but he didn't know how to be happy. His personal life never went smoothly. There were relationships, brief, soulless, with people who left as easily as they came. He blamed no one, neither them, nor himself. He simply understood, he hadn't yet met the one whose presence would let his soul breathe freely. Years passed. Outwardly, he became confident, even a little cold. But deep inside, there lived a quiet, almost childlike longing for something real, without lies, without roles, without the need to pretend to be strong. Sometimes, in the evenings, he stood by the window, looking at the city lights. And he thought that maybe, somewhere, there was someone who felt exactly the same at that moment. He didn't know that she, too, often looked out of her own window, from another city, another life, and dreamed of meeting someone, not knowing who. Years of solitude made him reserved. He had learned not to expect and not to ask, he simply lived, steadily and quietly, as if fulfilling a duty to himself. Friends saw him as successful, women found him mysterious, but in truth, he was just tired of the emptiness where every day looked like the one before. Sometimes, to silence the inner stillness, he took business trips, changing cities, countries, people around him. But no matter how far he went, the emptiness always followed, invisible, yet palpable. And then one day, a random phone call, a barely audible voice on the other end, changed everything. He couldn't explain why he wanted to hear her again. There was nothing between them, no promises, no expectations. Only the strange feeling that, after years of wandering, they had finally found each other. With her, he didn't need to be strong. He didn't need to pretend, he could simply be. And there was something new in that, something frightening and magnetic at the same time. He didn't know where those conversations would lead, but for the first time in many years, he wanted to live, not tomorrow, but now. At night, when the city was falling asleep and the streets grew quiet, she waited for his call. Those calls had become like breathing, without them, the evening felt empty and colorless. She would lie on her pillow, turn off the light, and listen to his voice in the silence. He spoke calmly, a little tiredly, but his voice carried something she had never heard before, warmth that asked for nothing in return. Their conversations lasted for hours. Sometimes they were silent, and even that silence was alive, full of meaning, emotion, and unspoken words. He told her bits and pieces about his life, carefully, as if afraid to break the fragile bond growing between them. She listened, feeling how his world slowly became part of hers. They talked about everything, music, books, childhood, and what it means to be truly human. And the more they discovered each other, the more they realized, this was not a random attraction, but something much deeper. Sometimes he called without a word. She would pick up the phone, and there would only be the sound of breathing between them. But that was enough. Because in that quiet breathing lived everything, understanding, tenderness, and that strange certainty that they were no longer alone. The spring of that year began with unease. The world had suddenly stopped, borders closed, streets fell silent, and ordinary life seemed to vanish overnight. She felt that something had changed not only around her but deep inside, as if the world had grown quieter, but fear had come closer. They still spoke every day. He called as soon as he woke up, and she answered, even if it was late evening for her. But now there was something new in their voices, not only tenderness, but anxiety. Too much news, too many losses, too much uncertainty. And then, silence. He couldn't reach her. Her phone was quiet the whole day, then another. When she finally answered, her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm in the hospital, don't be scared. I'll be okay." He froze, unable to find words. Nothing seemed to matter compared to the fear of losing her. Each day he waited for updates from the doctors, checked the news from her country, stared at the clock as if he could make time move faster. She sent short messages. "Feeling a bit better today. The doctor says it's under control. But between the lines, he heard pain and loneliness. The world had changed, borders were shut, planes grounded, and the only thing that connected them now was hope. He kept her photo on his desk and spoke to it softly, as if she could hear. And she, lying under the oxygen mask, whispered his name like a prayer. And perhaps, that's what saved her. She sat by the hospital window for a long time, watching the spring sky where birds had begun to fly again. It felt as if each of them carried a promise, unspoken, yet alive. When the doctor told her she would be discharged the next day, she simply nodded, unable to fully believe it. After everything, the world felt fragile, like thin glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. That evening, she reached for her phone. The screen was filled with missed calls, messages, short lines heavy with worry. And among them, just one word from him. Live. She smiled. It was the first real feeling she'd had after weeks of pain and uncertainty. Her hands trembled as she dialed his number. He answered immediately, as if he'd been holding the phone the entire time. When she whispered, "I'm home, almost. They're letting me go tomorrow." He was silent for a long moment before breathing out softly. Thank God. They didn't say much. Every word now was like a breath, rare, careful, yet full of meaning. He told her how every morning he'd watched the sunrise and spoken to her in his thoughts. And she listened, feeling life slowly return to her chest. The next day, when she stepped out of the hospital, the wind touched her hair. The world was alive again, the noise of the street, the sunlight, the scent of spring. And deep inside, she felt it clearly. This was only the beginning. When she stopped answering his calls, the silence in his home became unbearable. He didn't play music, didn't turn on the news, afraid to hear something that might shatter his hope. Days blurred into one long stretch of waiting. He drank too much coffee, barely slept, and often caught himself speaking to her out loud, as if she were still there. On his desk lay her photograph, the one where she's laughing, radiant, alive. Sometimes he would turn it toward the window, as if she could see the light better that way. He didn't know if she could hear him somehow, but he kept talking, softly, almost in whispers. About how much he missed her. About how afraid he was. And about how, if she didn't come back, the world would lose its meaning. When he finally received her short message, feeling a bit better today, he closed his eyes and simply exhaled. The tears came unexpectedly. Not tears of weakness, but of gratitude. He realized that since meeting her, something inside him had changed forever. Her presence, even from afar, had become a quiet light that kept his world from going dark. He had become different. Less harsh, more attentive. He started noticing small things, the scent of rain, the morning glow, the whisper of the wind. And in every one of those moments, he felt her. He didn't know when he would see her again. But he knew this much. If love could survive fear, illness, and distance, then it was real. After being discharged, she returned home, to the same house, the same walls, the same familiar smells. Yet everything felt different. It all looked unchanged, but the warmth was gone. Even the air seemed heavy with the past she no longer belonged to. Her husband greeted her without much emotion, more relieved than happy. He carried her bag, asked a few polite questions about her health, and that was it. His words lacked tenderness, only fatigue and indifference remained. She tried to smile, but something inside her quietly closed off. Evenings grew longer. He sat watching television, scrolling through news, making small talk about work. She sat beside him, but her thoughts were far away. Her eyes often drifted to her phone, to the messages filled with life and warmth, more real than anything around her. Since she realized she loved another man, her body no longer responded to her husband's touch. She avoided intimacy under various excuses: fatigue, weakness, fear of relapse. It made him tense, suspicious. His gaze grew sharper, searching, as if trying to find where the woman he once knew had gone. But that woman was already gone. Not in body, but in soul, living where her heart truly belonged. Sometimes, late at night, she would lie with her back to him, quietly unlock her phone, and reread their messages. Just one line from him, "Are you there?" made her heart ache. And in the darkness she knew, yes, she was there, with him, though miles apart. Here, there was only a shadow of who she used to be. Weeks passed since her return home. From the outside, everything looked calm, neat, quiet, predictable. Morning coffee, evening dinners, polite silence. But inside her, a storm was rising. Each day it became harder to play the role of the happy wife. The woman in the mirror looked faded, drained of light. Her smile was polite, her eyes, tired. She no longer expected words, affection, or even attention. Sometimes she wondered, is this how everyone lives? Habit, comfort, fear of change, perhaps that's what keeps people together. But deep down, she knew, this wasn't life. It was slow extinction. That night she couldn't sleep. He lay beside her, breathing evenly, peacefully. She stared at the ceiling, realizing how suffocating it felt to live a lie. The phone on her nightstand glowed faintly. She reached for it and opened a message that simply said, "You don't have to suffer to be good." The word struck her deeply. She suddenly understood, no one had the right to deny her the chance to love and be alive. Once, she feared losing peace. Now, she feared losing herself. At dawn, wrapped in a blanket, she sat by the window and cried, quietly, with relief. Those were not tears of pain, but of release. She knew a conversation awaited her. Painful, inevitable, but freeing. It was time to stop hiding behind a role and start living with her heart. Several weeks had passed since her return home. The house looked the same walls, the same curtains. The same photographs on the shelves. But none of it belonged to her anymore. It felt as if she lived inside someone else's life. Quietly repeating the motions of habit. Like an actress trapped in a role she no longer believed in. Her husband tried to act as if nothing had changed. Sometimes he asked how she felt. But his voice lacked warmth. And his eyes carried no curiosity. She caught herself replying with short answers. Just to avoid conversations. That no longer meant anything. At night she woke up to the sound of silence. Everything around her seemed too loud. The ticking of the clock, the wind behind the window. And her own heartbeat. Which seemed to echo somewhere far away. Where he was, unseen, but felt with every breath. She knew there were miles and borders between them. Yet deep inside she felt certain. They were bound. Like two notes of the same melody. Impossible to forget even when not played aloud. She waited. Waited for him to call. To hear that voice. That gave her air and meaning again. She waited, because without him, the silence became too heavy to bear. In these lines, I want to speak about our two heroes. This is not a fictional story, it is the story of two people who live among us. I will not name them, nor the cities or countries where they live. This is a story of him and her. A story of how love was born between two souls who never imagined such a thing could happen in their lives. It is about the realization of a dream, the kind of love once read about in books. The kind that feels almost impossible, until it suddenly becomes real. And yet, it happened, just as it happened to the heroes of this tale. Now, they face a difficult choice. Not one about love, for that choice has already been made. But one grounded in life itself. A choice of where, in which country or city. They will decide, together, to be happy. He was waiting for her at the airport. Standing by the gate, holding a small bouquet of white lilies, the kind she once said were her favorite. His heart beat faster than usual, like a boy waiting for his first love. People rushed by, luggage wheels clattered on the floor, flight announcements echoed through the hall. And then, she appeared. That smile. The one that silenced the world around him. She walked lightly, as if carrying all the morning light with her. Their eyes met, and everything else simply vanished. He stepped toward her, and she moved toward him. Their embrace was long and silent. In it lived all the pain of separation, the joy of reunion, and that word that no longer needed to be spoken, love. He took her home, to his home, where every morning began with the aroma of fresh coffee and the steady ticking of an old clock. The house stood at the edge of a forest, its windows opening to a calm river. She looked around, the books, the paintings, the simple but warm kitchen, everything carried his presence. And suddenly she realized, this house, these walls, this air, they were now part of her. That evening, they sat on the terrace. He poured wine, turned on soft music. The sun slipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in warm shades of peach and gold. She looked at him, and felt that quiet fullness inside, the one that needed no words. She was home. Truly home. He woke up early, the morning was clear, the air fresh. And the room carried the faint aroma of coffee. He was already in the kitchen, standing by the window, staring thoughtfully at the river. He heard her footsteps immediately, turned and smiled. That same smile that once caught her heart at the airport now warmed her again from within. "Good morning," she said softly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm of the dawn. "Morning," he replied. "Coffee's ready." They had breakfast in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words seemed unnecessary. Their eyes spoke for them, calm, tenderness, understanding. Later, he suggested a walk through the city. She agreed with quiet joy. The streets were old and cobbled, with cafes at every corner, smelling of fresh pastries. He showed her his favorite places, told her stories, simple ones, but filled with warmth. And the longer she listened, the more she realized. Her destiny was now woven with this city, with this man. That evening, they returned home. He lit the fireplace and poured some wine. The fire danced softly on the walls. And in that peaceful silence, it felt as if life itself had paused, just to let them be. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, its light flickering in their glasses. They sat close, not touching, yet breathing the same rhythm of air. Time seemed to dissolve into this evening. There was no yesterday, no tomorrow, only now. She watched the flames and thought how strange life was. Once, she believed love was just a word, beautiful, but distant. Now she knew, it was breath, a glance, a touch, even the silence shared between two souls. He watched her. His eyes were calm, yet somewhere behind them lingered a quiet worry. He knew that happiness, no matter how real, was fragile, like glass. So he lived every moment with her as if it were his last, absorbing everything, her voice, the scent of her hair, the light in her eyes. "Have you ever thought," he said softly, "that maybe nothing that happens is by chance?" She smiled, still looking into the fire. "Maybe it's true," she whispered. "Maybe it was all meant to be, so that we could meet." He didn't reply. He simply took her hand. And in that gesture, there was everything, a promise, a fear, and a love deep enough to be silent. The morning greeted them with gentle light. Thin rays of sunlight slipped through the sheer curtains, falling across the floor, the chair, and her face. She was still asleep, and he stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee, unwilling to disturb the stillness. Everything felt simple, natural, as if they had always lived together. No grand words, no promises, just the quiet warmth of two people growing used to each other's presence. He watched her, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite name. She was beautiful even in sleep, not with the kind of beauty that dazzles, but the kind that soothes, softens the world, makes it gentler. She opened her eyes and smiled when she saw him. "Have you been up long?" "Didn't want to wake you," he said, coming closer. She stretched, pulling the blanket around her, and whispered, "It feels so good to be here." The words were simple, but they carried everything. Gratitude, love, and a quiet, fragile worry. As if she already knew that happiness must be guarded, for it never stays forever. He sat beside her, his hand brushing through her hair. "And I'm glad you're here," he said softly. "Just stay." In that moment, nothing else mattered. Yet somewhere, beneath the calm, a shadow of change had already begun to stir. In the evening, they sat for a long time on the terrace of his house. The soft rustle of leaves, the gentle glow of the lantern, and the glasses of wine created an atmosphere of calm, yet inside, their thoughts were in turmoil. They both knew, love was there, but love alone was not enough. A decision had to be made. A real one. What comes next? Where is their home? "You can't just leave everything behind and move to me," he said quietly, looking into her eyes. She smiled sadly. "Do you think it's easy for me? My life, my friends, my mother, everything is there. But without you, none of it means anything." He sighed. "Then maybe we start over. Somewhere neutral. A new country, a new home, without the past, without curious eyes." She thought for a moment. "Italy? Spain? Maybe Greece," he said. "By the sea. Where there's light, where everything breathes freedom." She imagined it, a small house by the sea, white walls, the smell of coffee in the morning, and him beside her, without hurry, without secrets. And for the first time in a long while, she felt truly at peace. "You know," she said softly, "I'm ready. If you're with me, I'm not afraid." He gently took her hand. "Then this is our path. And let the whole world wait." The next morning felt unusually quiet. She woke before him and stepped out onto the terrace. The air carried the scent of jasmine and salt, the sea was close. Wrapped in his shirt, she sat in a wicker chair and gazed at the horizon for a long time. Thoughts swirled in her mind. How would it all unfold? Could they endure what lay ahead? Yet deep inside she felt that she was exactly where she was meant to be. He appeared, sleepy, his hair tousled, and quietly came up behind her. "You're already awake," he smiled, wrapping his arms around her. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I just wanted to remember this morning." There will be many mornings like this, he whispered. Unless you change your mind. She turned to him. No. I've made my choice. I chose us. He realized there was no fleeting romance in her words, only calm certainty, the strength of a woman who had lived through much and finally found herself. That morning marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one without distance, only the sea, the sun, and two souls who had found their soul harmony. Several weeks passed. The house by the sea slowly became their world, a small terrace where she placed 2 cups of coffee each morning, the soft breeze filling the rooms with salt and freshness. Each day looked like the one before, and yet that was the beauty of it, simple, quiet happiness, without unnecessary words. He worked from home often, his laptop stood by the window, overlooking the endless sea. She wrote. Sometimes she simply recorded her thoughts, as if trying to capture what cannot be held, a fleeting moment, a feeling, the breath of love. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours, just watching the horizon. And in that silence, there was more meaning than in all the declarations of love ever spoken. But time, as always, had its plans. After peace comes new trials. Their dream of starting life together in another country now demanded real steps, documents, visas, permissions. She began to worry. What once seemed like a dream now required facing reality. Are you sure everything will work out? She asked one evening, looking at him. He walked over, wrapped his arm around her shoulders. I'm sure. What matters is that we're together. The rest, we'll handle. And she believed him. Because when the one you love says, we'll make it, that's all it takes to keep moving forward. The days went by quickly, filled with packing, calls, paperwork, and waiting. On the surface, everything seemed to be going according to plan. Yet deep inside, she felt a quiet unease, as if something within her resisted the inevitable change. She watched as suitcases slowly filled with her things, clothes, photographs, books, small reminders of her former life. Every little item seemed to whisper, "Are you sure?" At night, she couldn't sleep. She lay there, listening to the soft whisper of the sea outside, wondering if it was too bold, too soon. But then he would come, wrap his arms around her shoulders, and the worry would fade away. I know, he whispered, you're scared. But it's going to be all right. This isn't just your step, it's ours. I just don't want to lose what I've already found, she murmured. He smiled. Sometimes, to keep something, you have to risk it. What matters is not running away from what makes us truly alive. Those words stayed with her. She realized that yes, the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but this was the beginning of their real life. A life where every day would be a choice, to stay together, no matter what. She knew, before stepping into a new life, she had to close the old one. Running away solves nothing, it only leaves deeper wounds. When it was time to return, the suitcases stood by the door, silent witnesses of her choice. He quietly helped her carry them to the car. Are you sure you can handle this? He asked. She nodded. Yes. I have to. Not just for him, but for me. I need to end it myself. The road home felt endless. Cities, faces, houses passed by, all familiar, yet distant, as if from another life. When she finally entered her home, the same emptiness met her again. Her husband greeted her without warmth, merely acknowledging her return. They sat through dinner in silence. Then he asked, "What's happening to you? You seem elsewhere." She looked at him calmly. "Maybe because I'm not here anymore." He didn't reply. He just leaned back, staring at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. And she felt something inside her finally let go. There was no fear, no guilt, only clarity. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window under a starless sky, writing a letter, not an apology, not an excuse. Just words filled with truth. That love cannot be held by habit. And sometimes leaving isn't escape. It's the only way to save yourself. The morning was quiet, almost unreal. The house still slept, and she stood by the window, looking at the empty street. On the table lay a folded letter, no tears, no accusations. Just a few lines, each one like a breath. Words of gratitude, forgiveness, and gentle release of what once was. She walked through the rooms, ran her fingers along the furniture, the walls, the memories. And for the first time, she felt light. No anger. No pain. Just peace. It was over. The taxi arrived softly. She stepped outside without looking back. Her heart raced, but not from fear, from the quiet realization that her real life was ahead, waiting. In the rearview mirror, the city slowly faded, dissolving into morning mist. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, he sat on the terrace by the sea. A cup of coffee stood untouched in front of him. Every morning began the same way, with waiting. The phone was silent. He didn't know what she had decided, if she would ever come back. He simply waited. Not out of despair, but faith. Because when love is real, it finds its way. Through distance, through silence, through time itself. He looked up at the sea, the breeze brushing his face. She'll feel this wind, wherever she is, he thought. And he smiled. Quietly, like someone who knows how to wait. The plane landed under a soft evening sky. The lights of the airport shimmered, mirroring the quiet tremor in her chest. She stepped out of the terminal, holding a small suitcase. Everything she chose to take from her old life. No messages. No calls. She just knew, he would be there. And somewhere deep inside, she felt it. That invisible thread still pulsing between them. He stood by the old pier, holding a bouquet of wild white flowers. Not roses, too loud for such a moment. Just simple blossoms, like the life he wished to share with her. When she appeared, the wind caught her hair. He turned, their eyes met. No words, no tears. Only the sound of the sea and the golden light slowly melting into the horizon. She took a step forward. He did the same. "I came back," she whispered. "I knew you would," he said softly. And in that instant, everything that once hurt, distance, fear, doubt, simply faded. There was only them. And the sea, blessing their silence with eternity. Later, as they sat on the terrace where it had all begun, she smiled and said, "You know, I was afraid I couldn't leave everything behind. But now I see, I lost nothing. I only found everything." He nodded, taking her hand. "Because now, we have one home. Wherever we are, together." Mornings in their new home began with the scent of the sea. Through the open windows came the gentle sound of waves. And sunlight poured softly across the white walls, filling everything with warmth and peace. The house stood on a hill surrounded by olive trees. From there, the horizon stretched endlessly, where the sky melted into the water. Just as their two lives had finally merged. She always woke first. Quietly, she made coffee, set 2 cups on the terrace, and watched the seagulls circle over the bay. He joined her later, slightly tousled, and smiled, wrapping his arms around her. Now this is life. They never spoke about the past. They didn't need to. All that mattered was the present. Small joys, the taste of ripe fruit. Evening walks along the shore. Their laughter lost in the sound of the tide. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Just sat side by side. And that silence meant more than words ever could. She kept a little journal, brief notes about each day. Today the sea was calm. He laughed again, like that first day. I think, we're finally home. And somewhere in those simple lines lived their whole story, their soul, their harmony. She left. Quietly, without drama, without looking back. Behind her remained the city where she could no longer breathe. The house that no longer felt like home. And the man with whom only memories still connected her. Now, everything began anew. The sun of another country. The sound of the sea. The soft wind scented with salt and oranges. She stood on the veranda of their new home, watching as he came out to her with 2 cups of coffee. His steps, his gaze, his smile. This was now her reality. "You're smiling?" he asked, handing her the cup. "Just thinking," she replied. "Sometimes you have to lose everything, to finally find yourself." He nodded quietly. They both knew the price of this new beginning. They lived as if in a dream. Morning coffee, long walks by the shore, endless late-night talks. She painted again, the sea, the sky, his silhouette framed by the doorway. He wrote articles, gave online lectures. And in the evenings, read aloud to her by candlelight. The house was filled with the sounds of life. The soft hum of music, the whisper of waves, her laughter. They both believed this was happiness. Simple, quiet, and real. But even the brightest light casts shadows. She began to notice small changes, subtle, yet undeniable. He grew more thoughtful. Spent longer hours at his desk. And sometimes stepped out to take phone calls in private. She didn't ask. Not because she didn't trust him. But because she was afraid of what she might hear. Still, a quiet unease grew inside her. Everything changed one evening. She walked into the room as he was on the phone. "I can't talk now, she's home," he said softly. A woman's voice murmured something on the other end. He turned, saw her standing there, and quickly hung up. "It's just work," he said. "Nothing important." But that night, she couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, and in its rhythm, she thought she heard her own anxiety whispering. She didn't cry, she only thought. Could it all happen again? The days that followed were strange. They both felt the invisible wall between them. He tried to joke. She smiled. But the light in her eyes had dimmed. And then, one evening, she whispered, "I'm afraid of losing you." He looked at her. "You're not losing me," he said. "I just didn't want to bring someone else's pain into our world." She stayed silent. "I'll tell you everything," he added. "Tomorrow. I promise." The next day, they went to the beach. They walked in silence. The waves lapping at the shore. Seagulls calling somewhere in the distance. And there, he told her everything. About his sister, her illness, and how he didn't want to worry her until things were certain. She listened quietly. Then stepped closer and rested her head on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have trusted you." "No," he said softly, "I should have trusted you first." They returned home as the sun began to set. The house once again breathed warmth. He lit the candles, she set the kettle on. The same small rituals that make a life feel whole. She looked at him, smiled faintly, and slipped into his shirt. "Again in this one," he said, smiling. "It's a promise," she answered. "That everything will be fine." And that night, for the first time in a long while, they felt not just love, but harmony. The kind worth walking the whole road to find. Spring by the sea always arrives unnoticed. First, the sky becomes clearer, as if it has been washed with warm water. Then the wind changes its voice, not sharp, but attentive, whispering, "I'm here." And only later do you notice that the morning light is no longer white but golden, and the cups on the terrace seem heavier, filled not only with coffee but with silence you want to keep safe. They lived quietly. The house breathed with their steps, their breath, their small rituals. In the morning, she went out to the terrace before him, placed 2 cups on the table, and stared at the horizon, where the sky met the sea. He appeared quietly, as if afraid to disturb her morning meditation, and placed a plate with sliced figs beside her. "Today is a sweet day," he would say, and she would smile. "Then we'll live more slowly." She wrote. Sometimes short notes, sometimes pages flowing one after another like waves. She wrote about scents, salt, orange peel, wine they opened in the evenings. About sounds, seagulls, the gentle tap of a spoon on porcelain, the rustle of paper in his hands when he brought her an envelope marked, "Not urgent," when you wish. About silence, the kind that exists between 2 people who no longer need to explain. He worked by the window, turned slightly toward the sea. Sometimes he took off his glasses and watched the water for a long time. "It seems to me," he once said, nodding toward the sea, "It writes slower than you." "Maybe," she replied, "but its texts have no drafts." The days stretched like a thread on which they carefully strung small joys, trips to the market where vendors already recognized their hands, the old bookshop, the mastic liquor in a narrow glass she didn't like but drank from his hand, because that's how lips learn to laugh. They were happy, simply, quietly, honestly. And perhaps that's why the world decided to test them. The message came in the evening. Nothing special, just a short phrase, neutral words, but carrying that tension only the heart can catch. He read it and paused for a second, as people do when they still hope they've misread. "I need to fly out," he said, without looking at her. "A couple of days." "A couple of days," she repeated, as if tasting the words. "What's that like?" "It's quick," he smiled. "So quick you won't even have time to miss me." They didn't argue. All night, zippers scratched, shirts rustled, pages crackled as they were tucked into a folder. She ironed collars evenly and too carefully, the way someone does when afraid for the other to have everything in order while they're gone. He joked, kissed the top of her head, promised to bring back some awful local sweet liquor so they could laugh at it together. "You'll come back," she said at the door. "I always come back," he replied. "Because I have somewhere to return to." When the taxi took him down the serpentine road, she stood by the gate listening to the garden calm itself. Leaves settled back into place, the air grew round again, and the sea, familiar. And yet something in that morning felt different, as if a familiar word in a sentence had suddenly changed its stress. Waiting is another form of prayer. She realized that on the third day. The first passed in errands, the market, the post office, a forgotten book, a walk along the promenade. The second, in letters she wrote him but never sent. Today the sea smells of something warm and earthy, as if someone is drying herbs under the open sun. "I bought you those olives you like. They're waiting. I am too." By the third day, silence had become dense, like glass. It didn't cut, but it separated. She heard herself through it, muted, as if from another room. In the evening, the wind began to change its voice. At first it just moved the curtains, then it grew heavier, and from deep in the garden came the scent of wet soil. Color thickened on the horizon, not leaden, no, richer, spiced, and it made her want to wrap herself in his shirt, the one she loved to wear barefoot around the house. The news spoke sparingly: storm front, schedule disruption, restrictions. She muted the sound and listened to the sky. Night came swiftly, without the usual pink staircase down which sunset slowly descends. She sat by the window without turning on the light. Beyond the glass, already cold to the touch, the world moved on without them. 2 cars hissed by below, someone laughed too loudly on the pier, the laughter of those who don't know about another's waiting. The phone lay beside her like a hot stone she couldn't let go of. She didn't cry. She just spoke softly into the darkness, almost soundlessly, so as not to scare away the words. "Come back." And perhaps that was the most honest prayer love can offer. Close to midnight, the wind entered the house. Not literally, drafts in their home loved to hide, but tangibly, the air grew tight, a hallway lamp flickered, and somewhere under the roof the boards began to sing thinly. She rose, took a sip of cold water, returned to the window. It seemed the storm had come to look her in the eye. The phone call sliced the night like light, sharp, alive, without warning. She answered before realizing where her fingers ended. "I'm here," he said. His voice was hoarse, tired, and familiar, like the warmth of a palm against a cheek. "Everything's fine. The plane didn't take off, Storm. We're grounded. I just got the chance to call." She closed her eyes, and her eyes became doors. Behind them, it grew instantly quiet. "I thought I'd lost you," she said. "I did too," he replied. "Lost myself. With you, I exist. Without you, I just move." She laughed and cried together, without choosing. He stayed silent, breathing, and that breath meant more than any words. "When will you come back?" "As soon as the sky opens." "All right," she said. "I'll wait." She didn't say, "as always." He didn't say, "sorry." They both knew such words are for when it's cold inside. And now, it was warm. He came back 2 days later. The morning was bright, like clean dishes. She heard the taxi before she saw him. The house always told her what mattered. The door opened, he set the suitcase by the wall, and they stood facing each other for a long time, not touching, as if testing whether reality would hold if they came closer. Then he stepped forward, and she, toward him. The embrace wasn't wild but deep, like the first breath after a long road. "I'm home," he said. "I know," she answered. That day they hardly spoke. He slept, long and heavy, the way seas rest after storms. She moved quietly around the house, like a cool shadow, cooking broth, airing the bedroom, sorting letters, and each gesture of hers said, "You're safe." When he woke, it was already evening. They went out to the terrace and sat in silence. Sounds returned to their places, the hum of the sea, the chime of a spoon, the match's flicker lighting a candle. "I thought the house had changed," she said. "But maybe it's us. We've become more attentive," he smiled. "And maybe that's what closeness really is, hearing even what isn't spoken aloud." She nodded, eyes steady. The sea before them was calm, but every gentle splash of a wave reminded them that a storm isn't an enemy, it's part of the ocean's breath. Just as worry is part of love. He touched her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You know," he said softly, "while I was there, I kept imagining your scent, orange peel, a bit of salt. I even heard the sea, though there was only the drone of engines." "I heard you too," she replied. In every pause between the waves. They sat silently until dark. Their home was peaceful again. And somewhere deep inside, a new certainty was born. Sometimes love isn't shown in words or promises, but simply in the fact that someone returns. Every time. She woke before him, as always on days when thoughts arrive earlier than the sun. Light rested on the sheets like a fine dust, and the sea, not yet noisy, only breathed through the half-open window. She rose barefoot, slipped on his shirt, and went to the window. Her reflection in the glass looked calm, faintly astonished, as though she had met someone new within herself. If we had a child, she thought suddenly, he would probably breathe as quietly as he does. She turned, he was asleep, cheek pressed into the pillow, and she wanted to touch his forehead the way one touches something fragile. On the terrace, she set down 2 cups. The sun was rising from the water, slowly, like a promise. He came out almost soundlessly, warm ceramic in his hands, smiling as if seeing her for the first time. "Good morning," he said. "It smells of rosemary and something new." "Mornings always smell of something new," she replied, and silently added, "I want it one day to smell like childhood." They sat quietly, and between them was that rare morning harmony after which one never wishes to hurry. At breakfast, she said casually, "Yesterday on the beach I saw a little girl. Curly hair, laughing louder than the waves. Eyes, like yours." He looked up, smiled briefly, but didn't answer. That tiny pause, like a micro scratch on glass, caught the sunlight too sharply. He poured her juice, slid the plate of figs toward her. "Eat. It's going to be a long day. Then we'll live slower," she said, trying to joke. Later, he went to his laptop, and she opened her notebook. The words came easily, yet between the lines settled a quiet expectancy, a sound too faint to hear, but enough to change the rhythm of her heart. In the evening, she noticed he lingered by the sea. He sat on the pier, motionless, like a stone that waves either embrace or test for strength. She came closer but didn't sit, only stood beside him, while the wind turned her hair like pages in a book. "You don't want children, do you?" she asked softly, as if afraid to scare away the answer. He didn't turn his head. Only his shoulders tensed slightly, like a sail before the wind. The silence lasted just long enough for her to regret the question. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think about it, Anne. I'm afraid to say the wrong thing." "Silence is an answer too," she whispered. And they walked home, each carrying their own shadow. That night, she couldn't sleep. She turned to him, took his hand, and laid it on her stomach, the way one places a hand over the heart, to see if it still beats. He stirred from the touch, looked at her with sleepy eyes, and didn't move his hand. They fell asleep like that, on the edge between sleep and a question. Morning came clear. He was sitting by the window when she woke, the sea shimmered in his eyes. "I'm afraid," he said without looking up. "Not of the child, and not of you. Of myself." "Of what exactly?" "That I'll lack, the rightness. The patience. The strength. That I'll repeat mistakes I swore never to repeat." She came closer, sat beside him, and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "And I'm afraid I won't learn fast enough. That I'll do something wrong." She smiled and brushed away a lone tear on his cheek. "But I do know I want to learn. With you." He pressed his forehead to her shoulder. The sea outside seemed to quiet down. A week dissolved into small things. Sometimes she smiled for no reason, sometimes she grew suddenly tired and sat by the window as one sits in a temple, just to be. He watched her more closely than before, as though learning to read by her breathing. "You've changed," he said one evening while lighting the candles. "I think I have," she replied, laying her hand on her chest as if listening to a new sound there. Maybe we're not alone. He didn't ask, "Are you sure?" He simply came closer and kissed her, a kiss filled more with gratitude than passion. And the house seemed to smile, in the whisper of curtains, the soft creak of floorboards, the warm circle of light on the wall. But happiness rarely comes without an echo. A few days later, he received a message. Short and dry, "Fly in for a meeting, urgent, 2 days." 2 days, she repeated, testing the words like water. "That's quick." "Very," he said. "You won't even have time to miss me." He joked while folding shirts too carefully, the way people fold their doubts. At night, the house rustled with the lightning of zippers. She smoothed collars, he thanked her for every small thing, the way travelers thank for clean water. "You'll come back," she said at the gate. "I always do. Because I have somewhere to return to." The taxi rolled down the hill, and the garden took long to settle after their embrace. The wind grew gentler, the sea deeper, and the words, 2 days, placed between them a wall, thin and invisible as glass. She lived through the first 2 days with errands. Market, letters, the promenade. The third, in silence. She wrote him long letters she never sent, "Bought your olives. They're waiting. I am too." By evening, the air filled with the scent of wet earth, the horizon thick and spicy, the storm was taking off its shoes at their doorstep. That night the wind entered the house, the lamp flickered, somewhere the roof began to sing. She didn't turn on the light, just sat by the window, the phone beside her felt heavy as a hot stone. "Come back," she said into the dark. "Just come back." The call came so suddenly her heart stumbled. "I'm here," his voice was hoarse and familiar. "Plane didn't take off. Storm. We're grounded. I just got the chance to call. I thought I'd lost you. So did I. Without you I only move. With you, I live." She smiled through tears. "When will you return?" "As soon as the sky opens." They didn't say, "I'm sorry." Warmth was enough. He came back 2 days later. The morning was clean as washed glass. The door opened, the suitcase touched the wall softly, and they stood facing each other, like before an icon. Then stepped forward, together. The embrace wasn't fierce but deep, like a breath after a long journey. He slept till evening, and she moved quietly, making clear broth, airing the bedroom, rearranging letters, and every gesture said, "You're safe." They met the sunset on the terrace. The candle flame scratched the air with a tiny golden claw. The sea was calm. "I thought the house had changed," she said. "No," he smiled, looking into her eyes, "we've just become more attentive." She placed his hand on her stomach, gently, as one sets fingers on strings before the first note. He said nothing, only drew her closer, and that closeness felt like a promise. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I'm with you." "That's all I need," she replied. Night fell slowly, softly, distant fishing lights shimmered on the water. The house breathed evenly. Between the beats of their hearts, there was no distance anymore, only warm air, within which someone's whisper was already alive. The house by the sea lived its quiet life. Each day the waves seemed closer, the silence more familiar. She would wake before the sun, and the first light would find her, sliding across the sheets, her shoulder, her hand still searching for warmth beside her. He slept peacefully, a faint smile on his lips, as if his dreams had no room for worry. She loved those fragile moments, as delicate as morning breath, when the world still slept and you could simply watch a new day being born. Sometimes she stepped out barefoot onto the terrace. The air was transparent, the sea rolled softly, gulls circled above the water. In those moments, she felt life moving, slowly, gently. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there was an emptiness. She never said it aloud, but he knew. He knew how long she had been waiting, how many nights she lay awake, listening to her body as if it might whisper an answer. They both wanted a child. But time passed, and waiting became an ordeal. At first, they hoped. Each month felt like a new chance from fate. She read articles, changed her diet, filled notebooks with notes and calculations. He tried not to show his worry, he joked, brought her chocolates, flowers for no reason. But the longer nothing happened, the quieter their conversations became. Sometimes she caught herself avoiding the mirror. As if her own reflection had turned into a reminder. Why, she would think. What's wrong with me? He sensed it, and he would just hold her, no words. Sometimes that silence said everything. In spring, they decided to see the doctors. White corridors, waiting outside offices, footsteps echoing on tile floors, the sterile smell of antiseptic, all of it felt too clean, too bright, too distant. She sat across from the doctor, listening to numbers, charts, statistics. Every word sounded like an equation. But she knew that a heart cannot be measured. It only aches. After one appointment, she walked out into the sunlight. And tears suddenly filled her eyes. He stood beside her, silent, steady. He didn't ask. He simply took her hand. They walked down the street among ordinary people. And the world went on as usual, cars, laughter, music from a cafe. But for her, that day felt like a turning point. She was too tired to keep fighting. Maybe it's not meant to be, she said that night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea. Maybe it's just, not mine. He knelt down in front of her, took her hands. Don't say that, he whispered. It will come. Everything does, when we stop counting the days. She said nothing. Only nodded, with a faint, fragile smile. Summer came. They left the city and returned to where it all began. A small house by the sea, with a terrace that smelled of salt and light. She loved the sound of waves breaking against the shore. In the evenings they sat on the steps, drinking wine, watching the horizon. The silence between them no longer hurt. It was gentle, forgiving, full of acceptance. He spoke about plans, a new project, a trip abroad, maybe a studio for music. She listened, smiling, though her heart still lived somewhere between, before and after. One morning she woke early. The sun was rising, the room filled with golden light. On the nightstand lay a folded note, written in his familiar, slightly uneven hand. She opened it and read. I've always known the miracle would come. It's only waiting for us to stop being afraid. She stared at the words for a long time. And then something shifted inside her. Not a revelation, but a quiet wave of warmth. As if someone had touched her from within. She didn't understand right away. But her heart already knew. She placed her hand on her belly. And for the first time in many months, she believed. The days changed. She smiled more, hummed while making tea, craved green apples and long walks by the shore. He watched her, not asking, just feeling. Until one morning, she showed him the test with 2 faint pink lines. He froze. Then laughed, a pure, boyish laugh. As if the whole world had suddenly turned to light. He lifted her into his arms and spun her around, while tears ran down her cheeks and she couldn't speak. That evening they sat by the sea again. Waves touched the rocks, the air smelled of jasmine and salt. She placed his hand on her belly. And he felt it, that invisible rhythm, that shared breath. Our miracle, he whispered. Yes, she said softly. It's real now. Pregnancy brought new kinds of days, slower, gentler, filled with wonder. For the first time in years, she stopped rushing. She listened to herself, learned to rest. To wake with gratitude instead of fear. She felt as though music had begun playing inside her. And its rhythm filled every corner of her world. The walls, the light, even the silence. He became more careful with her. Checking if she'd eaten, bringing fruit. Talking to her belly as if already meeting someone. Sometimes it made her laugh. But mostly it made her feel safe. He had become part of the miracle. Its quiet guardian. There were days of worry too, nights of doubt. When she feared to lose it all. But each time he held her close, the fear faded like mist. She knew, as long as he was near, everything would be all right. One evening the sea turned amber under the setting sun. They sat together on the terrace, a candle flickered on the table. She rested her head on his shoulder and whispered. I can feel him move. He went still, then smiled, pressing her hand to his heart. You know, she said after a pause. Sometimes I think everything we went through happened to teach us how to wait. Yes, he answered quietly. To wait, and not give up. The sea whispered below. Night descended on the house. And stars began to bloom in the windows. She used to be afraid of silence. Now she cherished it. Because in that silence, life was speaking. Later, before bed, she stood before the mirror. For a long time she just looked at herself. No longer searching for flaws. Only light, warmth, and the secret growing within. He came in, wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood together, looking at their reflection. 2 people, now 3. She closed her eyes and felt his breath align with hers. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For believing, when I couldn't. He kissed her temple. I just knew, he said softly. We love life too much for it not to love us back. She smiled, took his hand, placed it on her belly. And in that moment everything felt perfectly simple. The night, the sea, the heartbeat, the silence. It was all one melody. Outside, the waves murmured in the dark. The world slept. And in the little house by the sea, a new story was already beginning. A story of laughter, tiny hands, warm mornings, and endless us. She didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. Because she felt it. There was light in their home now. Real light. The kind they had been.